Now, life for slaves was arduous all in itself. However, there emerged a specific slave culture, especially on larger plantations where you had a larger population of slaves, if you will. Slaves came from largely from West Africa, but sometimes from different parts of Africa too. Like there were some from the southeast corner, maybe down from Angola or someplace like that too in the southwest. Largely, it was West African, and as they were not really allowed to be educated, what English they would eventually learn would oftentimes be mixed with some of their old tribal African languages, and you'd have basically kind of a pigeon type language to where you're able to communicate with each other with some of your old African ways of communicating along with English. So it's not really English and it's not really your African language either. Growing up in South Texas, I'm from the Rio Grande Valley, and it's the United States, South Texas, but I grew up 7 miles from Mexico. My hometown of Weslaco is about 92% Hispano, Hispanic, and a lot of folks down there don't speak good Spanish or good English. They speak Spanglish, if you will. Oye, vato, quiero watchar los Panthers el Friday, way. What did I just say there? Because that's not Spanish, and you threw in some English there too. That's neither. Um, but that's kind of what you see from that perspective. Um, in African society, you have kind of a blending of your old African languages along with English. And so you kind of have a slave language that would eventually become a little bit more sophisticated, but that sort of patois, if you will, survived for many different generations. And even to this day, you see a significant number of African Americans who have their own interpretations of things. Kind of like how I did, and the folks like my relatives and ancestors with their Spanglish. Oye, vato, ¿qué onda? Um, Music is oftentimes very important. He had a number of different African tribal musical interpretations or whatnot that are then interpreted and placed in with Western instruments and whatnot, and you develop this music that's born out of slave culture and the slave situation, and it just becomes a part of African American heritage and culture. A lot of it centered around their plight. A lot of it centered around what they do have. A lot of it centered around um, the things that are important to them. So a lot of times you would have, religious music, you would have political music, music asking about their freedom, anything else of the sort. Oftentimes you have African religions that have somewhat of of a voodoo type vibe or anything else like that. You have various different African religions. We'll talk about some of that here in a little bit. Their music was oftentimes influenced that. You have slave culture itself, where most slaves are expected to work 6 days a week, sun up to sundown. So that means that Sunday is typically the only day you may have off. That is going to be your day of worship. That's going to be your day for socialization on the plantation. That's going to be your day for prayer. It's going to be your day for social gatherings, religious events, anything you're passionate about. Sunday is going to be your day for all of those things. So that becomes a day that's immensely celebrated in slave culture on plantations. Oftentimes, songs would be written and passed down for generations or whatnot and celebrated. Um, you have various different instruments, oftentimes instruments that are primitive and made out of whittled stuff put together. Other instruments would be learned. You would have various different dances, oftentimes associated more with like African tribalistic dances that was different than your Western white folks. Um, Music oftentimes becomes a story, telling kind of a story in it. That just seems to be synonymous with it. Music that really expresses the idea of freedom and salvation kind of an angriness, an anger towards their slave owners. Makes sense. Um, all of these things were combinations of things that were treasured. It was an escape from their slave lives. That day that you had, that was your day to be human, to interact with people. That's where you could express your anger, your hope, um, anything else of this. And typically, oftentimes, slave owners, the masters, okay, as long as you don't physically rebel, do what you got to do. If it means that you're going to be more productive sun up to sundown the next 6 days, then do what you got to do. Okay, so a lot of times masters didn't really have a problem with this. Now, slave culture also had an influence with religion. You have Africans brought over who oftentimes brought their African religion, and then they would come to here, and most of them would adopt Christianity, but a number of them would convert kind of an interpreted Christian faith with some of their old African tribalist faith. So you have kind of their own incorporation of Christianity, incorporating some African voodoo type vibes and other African traditions that are different than your traditional Christian religions, like Catholicism, for example, or the Anglican Church, or anything else of the sort. And so you have various different religious conditions, and of course, especially if Sunday's your day of worship, you're going to be in a good mood anyway. That's your day off, basically. You're going to have very, very, very festive religious festivals, if you will, religious experiences, joyful. If you've ever been to an African American church and you've seen the gospel, or you've seen the choirs, you've been to, you may have seen snippets of it on TV or anything. Black churches are so fun. They have so much enthusiasm for the Lord. It is amazing. Every time I see anything like that, and I've been to one, it's like this is this has energy. This has enthusiasm for the Lord. That's wonderful. It's like, hey, do what you got to do. This is great. And it was largely born out of this era. Their enthusiasm for their faith was born here because that's really all they had. And oftentimes they would develop their own quasi churches, and of course it would be segregated from white folks and with their masters otherwise. But generally speaking, slaves used their religion for expressions of freedom, hope, salvation. Um, Oftentimes, white society, especially in Protestant society, you're hoping for salvation, life after death. Okay? Black churches didn't focus as much on that. They focused on their salvation in between. Okay? The slave family. I mentioned this a little bit ago, a few slides ago, about African American culture, and you have a number of single mothers and broken families and whatnot, and it comes from the slave days. Slaves could not legally marry, okay, but oftentimes they would have kind of their quasi marriages, an informal marriage between a slave man and a slave woman, and they may have a family. They may start a family out there on the plantation. Black women would oftentimes bear children far younger than whites. Um, you may have informal vows and have a child right after, or maybe you have a black couple who met and were allowed to informally marry under the permission of their slave owners and their masters. Okay, that was often allowed. A huge percentage of slaves, up to about a third of all slaves, were broken up. Their families were broken up because somebody else's plantation may buy a slave and that slave has to move. Well, that slave may be somebody's dad. Or plantation moves up shop and slaves are split up. Or slaves get bought and sold, and maybe some spouses try and run away together, or anything else of the sort, but oftentimes you have slaves that were split up because they were sold. That's a reality. So the breakup of the slave family was rampant around that time. I can only imagine. As a father of two children, and I have my wife, I would be ripped to shreds if I were taken from my family, especially against my will. This was commonplace in that era. Okay, so from a human standpoint, that was often rough. And then, of course, you oftentimes have black women who bore children from white men. Okay, um, result of sexual relationships, oftentimes, obviously, from assault or rape or anything else of the sort. Some were consensual as well. Um, you have children who are half white and half black. These are the children of white men. Oftentimes, these children, they weren't recognized as white. They're definitely not accepted into white society. You're half black. In other words, you're black. Okay? Typically, they'd be confined to slavery for life because of that fact alone, even if they had a white father. And oftentimes, they wouldn't be accepted by your black slaves either because they're not full black. They're half white. They're not really one of us, and yet they're one of us. Okay? So you have a whole hodgepodge of the slave family situation, family breakup, abuse, assault. This was a reality of the times. And the complex relationship between slaves and slave owners was oftentimes amicable, oftentimes not. The ones that were amicable, as I mentioned, you have a paternalism where you take the name of your slave master, and oftentimes they'd have somewhat loving relationships, if you can imagine that. But otherwise, though, the owners would provide for them security, protection, and housing and food. And that's a semi sympathetic relationship. Okay. Otherwise, though, the slave culture that was born from the Cotton Kingdom, that's the greatest stain in American history. And I've mentioned several different others. Um, the Indian Removal Act, removal of Native Americans along the Trail of Tears, that's another one of them. Slavery is the greatest stain in American history. Then followed by discrimination of black people after slaves were freed. We'll talk about that in future chapters. Otherwise, though, it's important to understand slavery, how it came about, why it was important for Southern culture, why people would perpetuate slave stereotypes and whatnot against black people, why it was necessary to do so, the striations between white society. It's important to understand all of those things. And it's important to look at it through a lens of understanding how we can recognize that and never repeat anything like that again. I love our country. We have so many wonderful aspects of our nation's history, especially in how we created a form of government that has never been tried before. The innovation that happens here, the opportunity that happens here. All wonderful. You've got to also understand there's some things that have happened that are very ugly in our nation's history. Slavery, without question, is one of those. We are still working to this day, understanding how we can improve society, how we can truly integrate black people and eliminate old things. We've come a ways. We still have a ways to go. It's important to recognize the struggles. Okay? I'm not a black person. I will never know the struggles of what it's like to live day to day from that perspective. I can only imagine. But at least it's opened my eyes to some things that may be going on that maybe I can understand and have a different perspective about. Okay? Cotton Kingdom, slavery, all necessary for that time.